Welcome to the Church of God Network podcast, everybody. I'm here today with Kelly McDonald. He is the president of the board of directors for the Bible Sabbath Association, and not insignificantly does a great William F. Buckley and Donald Trump impression. So I don't know which one of those things should be going first in your resume, but all impressive. How's it going, Kelly?
Things are going great, man. My wife just gave birth to twins about 15 and a half weeks ago. So feeling great about being a dad, but very tiring, very challenging. But, anything in life worth doing has challenges.
Yeah.
Just like ministry does, whether it's CGN, BSA, serving the brethren, trying to bring the brethren together despite their differences and even in some cases conflicts. Mm-hmm. And so if we're going to, help nations settle disputes, it's good to help brethren settle disputes today.
Yeah, absolutely. And there aren't too many better causes than your own twin children, right? So I'm sure it's edifying, if not restful. But why don't you give people some background for yourself personally? What's your church background, a little bit about your professional background so folks get a sense of where you come from?
Yeah, so I was born and reared in Jackson, Tennessee, which is between Nashville and Memphis. In fact, it's really the only major stop between the two. Anyone who's traveled on I-40, has probably stopped in West Tennessee, near Jackson at least. But I grew up Fundamentalist Baptist, and in 2007 was introduced to a Church of God group, and they actually invited me to keep Passover and unleavened bread with them. And I had never heard of such a celebration. And it was my first time ever going to a Sabbath group, a group that kept the Sabbath and, of course, that keep the feast also. And so I couldn't refute, though, the argument that Jesus and the early disciples did keep that day since it was shown to me in the New Testament. So I attended, and it set my life on a trajectory where by Tabernacles, I was keeping the feasts, the holy days, the Sabbath, clean and unclean, the whole 9 yards, and had begun a journey of transitioning my doctrinal beliefs from what I was used to a better way. In some ways, I got to keep some things I grew up with, like belief in the other 9 commandments. Those are still in effect. Yeah. But it was number 4 I didn't really understand.
Yeah.
And so, but I graduated from college here in Jackson, Lambeth University in 2009. At that time, became an independent agent at my father's insurance company, and have been an independent agent ever since then. So I'm considered self-employed, and I do have one employee, and she's a great worker, Miss Jill. She does a great job, and so yeah, I'm very blessed. And over the years, have been blessed to serve in my local congregation as a deacon and also an evangelist, and have served in a variety of roles, and have written dozens of pieces of literature pertaining to the Sabbath, the holy days, and various other doctrinal beliefs that we hold very dear, and with an emphasis on church history, of course. Yeah, in the last few years. So
yeah, that's great, and it's funny. Your own personal story sort of illustrates the main reason for the topic today. We were talking in planning this that there seem to be so many evangelical Christians right now going into Sabbatarianism. And of course, back when many folks who were watching this came into the Church of God sphere for the first time, my parents and so forth, they were coming in from worldly Christianity. And because the Worldwide Church of God at the time was such a big presence, such a public force, that was the first thing in people's minds when they were coming into that knowledge in many cases. But now, since the Church of God doesn't quite have the footprint it used to, I think most folks are going into messianic groups. Could be Hebrew roots, could be any number of different Sabbath-keeping groups. And so the same way, you happen to find a Church of God group, and there are plenty who do find Church of God groups, but there's a segment of the Sabbatarian community that the Church of God does not interact with that much. And we understand that we are not on the same page with even some of the core beliefs that Church of God Network lists on our website. And that's important to understand for this conversation. We're not saying that we're on the same page with a lot of these groups on even some core issues. But you mentioned the Sabbath. If our understanding about the Sabbath as this gateway drug doctrine to all kinds of other understandings is true, then that should be a very fertile ground for helping folks come into the knowledge of other things that are very unique to the Church of God sphere. And I know that's one of the things for the Bible Sabbath Association, which you're the president of the board of, is it's about promoting Sabbath keeping. And I think there's a value to understanding the importance of the Sabbath, especially as a first point of contact. So why don't you give us a little background about the Bible Sabbath Association, because you all have been around for a while.
Yeah. So the Bible Sabbath Association was founded in 1945 in Pomona Park, Florida, by Seventh-day Baptist believers, actually. And it was founded at a time anterior to the Church of God great outreach. It was just before that big explosion of outreach that occurred 50s, 60s, 70s during that time. And so probably the founders of the BSA didn't even know what the Church of God were. It was the Radio Church of God at that time. But they did know that there were Sabbath keepers who had beliefs in common, particularly belief that Jesus is their Savior, that salvation is only found through his sacrifice, but also as part of this new life we have as believers, obedience to the 10 commandments, with an emphasis on the fourth one, the Sabbath being Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. And so they knew that these core doctrines were held by many believers, regardless of what group they might belong to. And so the BSA was founded with this idea that let's try to work together and let's have an emphasis on what our common beliefs are. And we can even learn a little bit about our differences. Maybe we can be convinced to change one of our views. And maybe we can help convince you to do the same. So it's this idea that we have an open forum, a safe place for people to come to share their faith, their unique beliefs, and not feel condemned about it, but also have a chance to learn about each other, but also have a chance to have our mutual beliefs reinforced. And so as time went on, the Church of God Seventh Day, which the Worldwide Church of God and other Church of God groups trace their lineage back to, this Church of God Seventh Day got involved. Well, word continues to spread, and as time goes on and you get into the 60s and the 70s, the Seventh-day Adventist group really has a big imprint with the BSA. And then as we get into the 90s, the Church of God groups really have made a tremendous impact. And because the BSA, again, those core beliefs are very simple, the potential for outreach is so large. And so, but as the decades have progressed, different Sabbath groups have had a larger imprint over time. And from the 90s and now, the biggest imprint has been from the Church of God. But we have seen an increase in Messianic Hebrew roots believers as well, participating in the BSA. We have a magazine called the Sabbath Sentinel, which is a free magazine that anyone who adheres to our core doctrines can write for and also subscribe to. And so, so the BSA has been this open forum that people can learn about. There's things about the Sabbath history, keeping the commandments of God, testimonials about how people find the Sabbath, testimonials about how people stood strong in the midst of persecution for observance of the commandments. Is so important in helping us realize we're not alone. There are so many Sabbath keepers that are scattered. You'll find a pocket of a handful here, 10 or 15 there. And the BSA, like CGN, we're trying to help link these groups together, provide them resources, and give them an opportunity to meet people that they might not ever meet or talk to. And so the BSA has had a tremendous success over the years, having been around that long. The Sabbath Sentinel started in 1955. In fact, when the 1995 Church of God quake, as it's sometimes called, the big split, we'll say, when the Worldwide Church of God had some bad doctrinal changes, we'll say, the BSA, I have had people come up to tell me that the BSA literature, the Sabbath Sentinel magazine, helped them stick with the truth during that tumultuous time, because a lot of people thought that was the only true church, and they were confused about what they were being taught versus what the Bible said, and they just needed someone to be there to affirm the truth in a time of confusion, and the BSA was there to do that. And so it's good to have associations and networks like CGN and the BSA, because even if top-down groups abandon truth, or whatever may happen or fall apart, we're here to provide those resources, and we can help direct them to other believers where they can continue fellowship and also have their faith be edified. So
yeah, and it's also great because not only is there room, but there's sort of a need for organizations that are not churches in the church space. Like, it's a very unique space, and there are needs that aren't met, not because they are being done poorly, but just because a church, maybe that's not their main goal, can't go into. So the idea of an informational forum with a barrier to entry that's more minimal, like the Sabbath and maybe a couple other doctrinal points, is really useful to people who are either confused and looking for information, or folks who are new to the community, and as like a first point of contact, and again, a forum for information, so that if God's calling them, they have at least have access to all these different things. And I think I told you in the planning call that one of my absolute best friends, who actually was going to a seminary for an evangelical group. He was like a very well-read scripturally, but your typical mainstream Sunday keeping Christian. All of a sudden, 6 months ago, goes, well, he didn't go directly to me first. I started seeing his wife say "Happy Sabbath" on like social media and stuff like that, and I'm thinking, is this just, did they realize the Sabbath is important, and maybe it's like just a cutesy thing that people in the Old Testament used to do, so it's sort of like a traditional thing, or do they really believe you need to keep the Sabbath? And sure enough, after speaking with him, he goes, the Sabbath is a test commandment. Like, that's the mark of God's people. And so here's someone who, even though we've talked about theology a ton, I do not believe for a second it was my influence. He just came into the knowledge himself, and he might have a connection with the Church of God because I'm personally in his life, but I think there are so many people like him. And you and I are talking about, at least anecdotally, I don't know if you have any data to support this, but there seems to be a significant movement from evangelicalism into Sabbatarian communities. And coincidentally, after you and I spoke to a pretty high up minister in one of the big Church of God groups, and he said the same thing. Anecdotally, he's seeing a lot of folks going into these communities. So it sort of makes sense for us to have some point of contact, even if, like, BSA is not a church, but that connecting piece of facilitating the information flow and getting some of these doctrines and communication to these groups or these new people coming in provides a valuable service.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And because we're association network, we're not a church, we're less intimidating to approach.
Right.
People don't feel as intimidated, don't feel like, well, I wonder what they'll say about this or that. They can come to us and we can say, here's the resources. And I think, one of the beautiful things about it is we can help mend fences between different groups. We can help mend, because, let's just be honest, there are groups that have animosity toward each other that goes back. I'll give you an example. In the 1980s and around that time period, even until more recently, the Seventh-day Baptist and Seventh-day Adventists had a tract, counter-tract, kind of back and forth battling. And here between them is the BSA, and we have people from both groups that participate, that get along. And sort of in that time when that was really heavy going on, sort of exemplified this idea that, hey, we can get along and we don't have to make up things about each other that aren't true, and so that we have to do a tract, counter tract, and when as it pertains to the Church of God, which is more recent history for CGN, but also for the BSA, these different Church of God groups, whether it's United, Living, Independent, whoever it may be, they can participate in the BSA, in CGN, and we can all get along, and there's
no need to leave your group, right? Like, stay where you are. Yeah. Any of those things in terms of there's no competition. It's not like you can leave your group to join the BSA or CGN. There's nothing for you to do, nothing to join. Like, we don't provide services or anything. But again, these conversations are so important, especially because, I think it's probably twofold. The first being what we mentioned before about so many people seeming to be coming out of evangelicalism now. And a very interesting topic at some point in this conversation will be sort of us discussing the seemingly increase in social upheaval that's happening, at least in the United States, that you would imagine would lead to more folks coming into this knowledge, but also just highlights the importance of the Sabbath. And one of the things you mentioned being that you always loved the other 9, but it was the fourth commandment that always was the issue. And it is funny that when it really comes down to it, the Christian groups, is very specifically an anti-Sabbath attitude. So when someone comes out of that, realizes that the scriptural admonition is to keep the Sabbath, it unlocks a door. And as a result, maybe we could transition into that discussion now, that I'm sure most people listening will acknowledge that it seems like there is more social upheaval either happening or about to happen now than there has been in the States in quite some time, probably since the late 60s. And before I go any further, I know you have plenty of thoughts on that. Did you want to riff on that for a bit?
Yeah. So to get back to what you were saying, the Sabbath, in a way, I'm sort of part of that movement of people spontaneously finding. In my case, it was just an incredible series of connections that God made to put me in touch with a Sabbath keeping group. But the Sabbath is unique in that whether I'm tested on stealing or lying or anything else throughout the week, I may or may not happen. But the Sabbath will happen one way or the other.
That's a good point.
It is an unstoppable. It's an unstoppable opportunity or test, you might say. And so, as I grew up, I was never told that Saturday was. I thought Sunday was the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And so, when I go to this new congregation, I just kind of visited off and on Saturday, and the pastor says, "Well, the Sabbath Saturday." I never even challenged it. It's so amazing. And but there are such an increase of people coming into the Sabbath at this time. And I think that the social upheaval that connects us to the 60s is so very similar, because that was the time period in when the Church of God, Worldwide Church of God, really began to explode. It's so amazing. You look at the social upheaval of that time. You had the sexual revolution that was happening at that time. You had the Vietnam War that was going on there in the 60s into the 70s. You had the civil rights movement that was going on at that time. You had so many things, and people were really beginning to question, well, what's the truth? How do I know? And people were beginning to questioning the government, questioning in the South, questioning norms about social things, questioning sexual. There were all these questions, and the Worldwide Church of God sort of said, yes, there are problems in the world, and yes, the governments of this world, guess what? They're not going to fulfill all your needs. Yep. And yes, there are wrongs going on in the social realm of our country. And so here's the solution: God's church coming in, the kingdom of God. That is, through the kingdom, we come into this community of people who come together for the same purpose. And we come into that through Jesus Christ. And we have a relationship with the Father, and we have a relationship with each other. And it is it is what we would say in sociology. It is a subgroup that separates us from the things we don't like about the world around us, but puts us in touch with the solutions. Yeah. And so that's so beautiful.
Yeah, that's a great, and the point too about the thing I've been thinking about the Sabbath specifically, because I think it's because of what we're talking about now, it's an important issue to emphasize the Sabbath, but I also see a lot of young people in the Church of God starting to question why the Sabbath is this test commandment. And I think it's very important because not only, as you said, it was a great point that it happens every week. It's a constant test, but also when you look at the 10 commandments, I think look at what else the Sabbath is next to in terms of the moral commandments. I think people tend to downplay the moral or spiritual importance of the Sabbath within the context of those 10 commandments, but it's right there. It's with murder, or it's with idolatry and honoring your father and mother and not bearing false witness. Like it's the same part of that law. And just because you might not at a certain point see that equivalent, or maybe you haven't done the study to understand the significance, once you get to the point that you realize the necessity for the Sabbath, I think it opens up this door to, well, what else is there that I haven't, usually that I haven't been taught by the church that I'm going to? Because to your point, these social upheavals are usually about distrust in traditional institutions. And so the 60s was a distrust of government for the first time, right? You had JFK assassination, you had which was cited as like a loss of innocence, I guess. You had the Richard Nixon Watergate was the thing that really blew the doors off of things, Vietnam War. So you had all these things that just made people distrust government on both sides. Then you had the social revolutions against moral norms and therefore religion. So you had a move to alternative religions of all kinds. I mean, not only just the Church of God, but you had some out there things. You know, the Moonies, I think, was the 70s or 80s or something. Like you had all kinds of you had a large body of people looking for an alternative explanation, and it was such a fertile ground for the Church of God. And I think we're coming up, if we're not already in a similar situation where you have things like, can a man be a woman is on the table, right? Like everything is on the table. And again, anecdotally from our peer group and younger, so many folks, the amount of times I now hear both sides of the aisle are nuts is unique to my lifetime. I mean, there's still plenty of people who play team sports of Republican versus Democrat, conservative versus liberal, but there are way more people who might identify ideologically as liberal or as conservative, who look at both sides of the aisle, who look at the institutions in general and say, this is nuts. And I think they just sort of live in a state of confusion. So you have the younger folks, maybe 40 and under, going through that. And I think we talked about this as well, that for the folks who might be older, who maybe are steeped in a religious view, and they see what they perceive as an attack from the left or progressivism, and they go, well, I'm going to get closer to my Bible in response. And then they get in there and they find something like the Sabbath. Right. If all these things are prompting young people to question everything and older folks to go back to their Bible, it stands to reason that there would be a necessary influx and at the very least interest in the Sabbath keeping community and hopefully the Church of God by extension.
That's exactly right. You know, the Sabbath is so unique in the Bible. Number one, it's mentioned in 140 verses. It is among the, if not the most mentioned subject in the whole Bible. It's the first thing God made holy. It's the only day that God rested on there in the creation week. It's the only day God blessed in the weekly cycle. It's the first of the 10 commandments that are mentioned. And so it's amazing that in the new heavens and the new earth, guess what's mentioned? Isaiah 66, 22 through 23. It's the Sabbath. It says there, from one Sabbath to another, and from one new moon to another, all mankind will worship me. Yeah. And so the Sabbath is found in the beginning and at the end. And I tell people that the Sabbath is so unique. I'll tell you a story actually that ties into this. I was speaking at our Murfreesboro, Tennessee congregation there in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is about 2.5 hours from me. And the business next door was having some kind of outdoor get together, and one of the young people that was hanging out at this little get together, and they were cooking, grilling and that kind of thing, and playing loud music. And I had to preach a little louder because that music was so loud. That's okay. If I have to, I have to, Yeah. One of the kids peeked their head in the door and then left. And I this was after service. I ran out there and said, "Hey, you want to hear about Jesus? You want to learn about the Sabbath?" And I just, and that kid just didn't seem interested. Well, about 10 minutes later, 3 kids walked in. And they said, "We heard we could learn about Jesus." And I said, "Come sit down. Let me tell you about Jesus." And I began to talk to them about Jesus on the basis of the Sabbath. Did you know he's Lord of the Sabbath? That's right. He died for your sins, but he's also Lord of the Sabbath. Now, when is the Sabbath? And they all said, "Well, that's Sunday." And I said, "Well, what's Saturday in Spanish?" And they got their little Siri out. "What's Saturday in Spanish?" Sabados, and oh, wow. And so I began to walk them through the word about the Sabbath. And I finished, though, with this thought. I said, would you like to be in a world where you didn't have to worry about war? suffering. Have you guys ever lost a family member and been sad and sorrowed by that and heartbroken? Are you tired of that kind of world? Well, guess what? The Sabbath connects us. Isaiah 66, Revelation 21, 22 connects us to a world where there is no more suffering, where there is no more sorrow, where the pain, the death, the old order of things has passed away. And that is something that is appealing to every human being because the fall and the sin of Adam affects us all because we are in the likeness of Adam. And the Sabbath reminds us that the Lord of the Sabbath came to redeem us as the last Adam from the sins of the first Adam, which we are in the likeness of. And we are reborn and remain in the image of the last Adam. And we are connected to this world that is to come that we look forward to. And so, yes, as we see the world becoming more unstable, more unrest, the Sabbath in particular is a great gateway drug, gateway obedience for people to connect to God, but connect to that world that is to come where these things are not plaguing us. Do you know anybody who hasn't been affected by sorrow, death, pain? No, all of us have. And so this message of the kingdom of God with that emphasis on, hey, the Sabbath, this weekly obedience to God, this weekly, I've always said the gates of heaven are open on the Sabbath, in that there is God's presence is woven into that time period. I said, even if you happen to be sick and can't go to church, or you're not near a congregation, because his presence is in that day because he made it holy. The only thing that makes time holy is his presence. It's like the mountain where Moses was. God said, take off your shoes. This is holy ground. It's not that it was holy because it was a holy mountain. It's because God was there. That's what made the mountain holy. And so the time is holy, and God wove his presence into the time. And so there is a special connection that we can make to God that's not found any other way. We can pray any day of the week. We can read the Bible. We can talk to people about God. We can, get together, have Bible studies. That's all great, but there is a special access to an intimacy with God that exists because it is a gateway into that world where those things which we loathe so much are no longer there.
And it's also, I think there's something about it being so obvious when you crack open the Bible too. You know what I mean? Like there's no real way around it. And what's funny is there are so many fundamental, especially a couple that you just referenced, which I think are two of the most beautiful and important things about Church of God understanding, which is mankind cannot govern itself. You referenced, hey, look at all these governments. They will never be able to solve our problems. And two, this is not the only day of salvation. So the whole idea of not only a lack of suffering in the world tomorrow, but the folks who never had access to God's truth, they're not burning in hell forever. Like there's those understandings, I think, flow from the Sabbath. And God can use whatever understanding he wants to be the gateway, but it sort of makes logical sense that when you first identify, this obvious thing that I haven't been doing for so long is actually commanded in Scripture, what else is there? Oh, well, the holy days are commanded. Oh, well, what do the holy days say about God's plan of salvation? What does it say about the nature of God, even in terms of the belief in a Trinity? Which I do know there are Sabbatarian groups that believe in it, but in terms of it being a progression of understanding, the Sabbath is a gateway to finally understanding some of those things as well. It's in the Sabbath, it's in the Sabbaths through the holy days, and then when you understand those days, it's, well, why do you need this? What is God's plan? What's the narrative? Well, the narrative is we can't govern ourselves. We took unto ourselves the knowledge of good and evil through Adam and Eve in the garden, and we have been given a period of time to show ourselves through a track record. This is what happens when you do it your way. I'm going to let you do it. I'm going to, with only minimal interference so that you don't wipe yourselves off the face of the earth. But try everything. Because when this is done, you're not going to be able to say you didn't let us do it our way. And the irony of all this is when we took of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we took onto ourselves the belief that we are God. We can determine for ourselves what is good and evil. And one of the beautiful things about Church of God understanding is the ultimate destiny of man. The plan of God for mankind is to expand his family. But again, it might sound weird, but it starts with something as simple as the Sabbath. And it's this progression. And I think with your point about it being not only a weekly reminder, but it's a commandment that has a weekly test. And so you have an opportunity to observe it or not every week. And so much comes from that fact. And I think the logical, extension of that, and probably the second half of our conversation becomes for Church of God Network's audience, which is the Church of God, what should our posture be to this Sabbath keeping community that might not be beholden or won't have a belief of the 10 core doctrines on CGN's website, which is pretty fundamental to all the COG groups, but has something like the Sabbath. They've entered that process, even if some groups might not feel comfortable having services or letting one of their folks preach there. What should the posture be? What kind of communication should we have with that sphere, whether not only for the sake of just the open forum, but also for preaching the gospel? Like it's another, the gospel includes the Sabbath, but it's more than that.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. I mean, there are obviously other Sabbath keeping groups that have a range of doctrines. You might look at it, if we were to compare it to the Church of God, on a spectrum. And there's some Sabbath groups that are actually very close doctrinally. I mean, I know some Hebrew roots groups that believe nearly identical as Church of God groups, with the exception of maybe zeets and a shofar. I mean, but if you think about all the other beliefs, it's a very small difference. Whereas we have others that are very much different outside of, say, the 10 Commandments and belief in Jesus and the return of Jesus, et cetera. And so I would like to highlight this point, though, by bringing in another example. In 2019, I had the opportunity to speak in Idaho, and it was a Church of God group that advertised. This is where BSA, CGN really come in handy. Advertised. I spoke about early church history and the Sabbath, and did what I consider a summary of the first few hundred years. And they had groups from a Church of God group different than the one it was hosted at. They had some Seventh-day Adventist believers there. They also had some Hebrew roots and some independent Sabbatarians. I didn't get to ask these people all their beliefs, but so you had at least 4 different groups, possibly more, represented in
very
one
different
room.
ones. Yeah.
Very different ones, and some that did they did. And the thing is, they didn't think about their differences to come to that event. They thought about there was a subject matter that is a mutual belief that we could come together and agree that the Sabbath was not changed by, no one can change the Sabbath, and that's why even when church groups get off on Constantine changed the Sabbath, or Paul changed, or not Paul, I mean the Pope or whoever changed it. Nobody can change the Sabbath. Let's go ahead and put that rumor to rest. But this idea, but people want to know what actually happened. Why is it that we look around today and see that most people that identify as a Christian meet on Sunday? Why is that? Great question. When we read the New Testament, everybody's keeping the Sabbath. All the early Christians are keeping the Sabbath. And so we were able to give an answer to that question in the ancient history for the development of Sunday. And so that's an example of how we can help bring people together, have an event, pick a subject that's of mutual interest, and then have a speaker who is connected to a group. And there have been times in modern history, there are speakers who had that, who could identify with their own group and still have an outreach that was, let's say, interdenominational. Samuel Bakioki is a great example, a great Seventh-day Adventist scholar who studied at the Vatican. Who you could advertise Samuel Bakioki, Seventh-day Adventist scholar, and people from all kinds of backgrounds. I mean, he spoke at some Winter Family Weekends when he was alive for the Church of God. So
he was very important to a lot of people when the apostasy happened and worldwide blew up. He was a very important read for a lot of people.
He was, and he was a stabilizing force. And so, but having a speaker come who can have that, people aren't going to look at this person as a, say, partisan or a polarizing figure, that's one great way. Another great way, I really think, is to establish a relationship with those, go to lunch. If the pastors would go to lunch with, or just members in the congregation, try to connect and have lunch with each other and just talk about, hey, you know what? there's people coming to our congregation. They may not believe just like us, but I tell you what, if they more identify with your group, we'll send them to you, because at the bottom line, we don't want these people to not have anywhere to go to church, and maybe having a gentleman's agreement. Hey, and if you get somebody who comes to your congregation who believes more like our group, send them our way. We have practiced that. I know in our community and other churches, I know that they practice that, where there's this agreement where, yeah, you may get someone coming to your church. They may not believe everything, but they want somewhere to keep the Sabbath.
Yeah.
At least point them somewhere where they can keep the Sabbath. And who knows, they may come back, But if you just shut them down and kick them out just because they don't understand everything just the same way, or I'm not saying that you ask them to leave, but, you can feel people out after a while. And if they act disinterested, let them know, well, there's other congregations, but you're always welcome to come back here if things don't work out. Mm-hmm. And I really think that, having that open relationship, and these other churches will send you people as well. That's just, we're just facilitating, facilitating fellowship with each other. And I think also trading literature with each other is another great idea on mutual beliefs, where we can see that, yes, there are differences, but hey, there's a lot of similarities. I've always said that I believe that one of the greatest audiences to reach about the holy days for Seventh-day Adventists, and one of my reasonings for that is the Sabbath. First of all, it is the template. The weekly Sabbath is the template for an annual Sabbath. And so but I've gotten a lot of criticism in BSA president because we have Seventh-day Adventists who maybe write or contribute in different ways to the BSA. But I'm sitting here saying, I just tell these people, I say, well, they get to learn about the holy days because they're connected with the BSA. They might not even know that these holy days have meaning. Yeah, there's a plan of salvation connected to them.
It's about,
they think they're Jewish, but
yeah, it's about sharing information. If you have beliefs which I believe are unique and can expand someone else's understanding, we should want to share it. And I think there are levels, right? You have the role we have within the body of Christ to like the Church of God, in terms of, so that's like the in-house role. You have preaching the gospel to the world. And it sort of seems like this is in between. It's almost like a people in an in-between phase where the door is cracked open, right? If you go into a Baptist church, there might be some people there who might change their minds if they hear a compelling case. But by and large, there's nothing inherent in there's no crack in the door to get in. But when you have something as fundamental as the Sabbath being opened, you might have, like you said, you mentioned the Seventh-day Adventists. They're pretty mainstream on most of their beliefs outside of like the Sabbath. But I know from talking with you that internationally is a bit different than American in terms of whether they keep Christmas and Easter. But it's about sharing an understanding, which we all view as beautiful, having that dialogue. And who knows what's going to come from it, because conversion is a process, and at any given time you're taking a snapshot of a person's conversion or point in their conversion. So stage one might be a few years in Seventh-day Adventist. I happen to know a minister who one of my favorite people who started off in Seventh-day Adventism, worked for their nonprofit, went to Church of God Seventh Day, and now is in Church of God. And he just went through that process of learning. And the only way people can learn is if you expose them to the necessary information. If you've never been exposed to information, it's much harder to come to it yourself. Yeah, you can read the Bible and see it there. That is the ultimate text. You can do it there. You don't need other people, but to have teachers or other people sharing is hugely important, right? When you came in, you had people there to help in your conversion process intellectually and otherwise. And that's the role of brethren.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, at the end of the day, yes, people can find it on their own, but God still uses people. Yeah. So, and he wants, in the early church, you look at Ananias, for instance, right there in the book of Acts, who prayed for Saul, who we call Paul, who became an apostle. He's not given any title, to my knowledge. He's just Ananias, a devout believer, and so God wants to use each and every one of us to be the hands and the feet and to connect the body. And so I think that being aware of our surroundings, like, I have insurance clients since COVID. Something happened with COVID. I had a client tell me, she contacted me. She said, Kelly, when COVID happened, I didn't have anywhere to go. So I picked up the Bible, started reading. I kept seeing the Sabbath. Everywhere I looked, I saw the Sabbath. Yep. I mean, it was hard to read so many books of the Bible without seeing the Sabbath. And I said to her, and I said, well, I just went into the explanation of the importance of the Sabbath. And she asked me, well, why did they change it? And so I got to tell her. And I guess she knew I kept the Sabbath somehow. She found out I never had talked to her about that subject. And it was so funny. Just the other day when you emailed me, I just got off the phone. Or no, it was before a planning meeting. I had just got off the phone with a client who was asking me about the Sabbath. And I'm going to try to do an in-home Bible study. And I think that we as believers, this is something I think is so important, especially for the younger generation. I think people and I'm not trying to criticize the older generation by no means. I'm just saying I think the younger people are starting to come to the realization we've got to own what we believe.
Mm-hmm.
We got to own this thing. We got to be able to explain it for ourselves. I mean, it's great that the minister man is up there and he's telling us this stuff and he's hashing out doctrine. He's putting line on line. That's great. I'm not diminishing that. But we as believers, we need to have a grasp on our own beliefs and be able to explain them because, yes, we do need to be able to do. I'll tell you, there are some groups, and I don't want to get into the names, et cetera, but there are some Christian groups that grow. And Seventh-day Adventists, one thing they do well, home Bible studies. What they do is they develop these little tracks, study tracks, and they give them to people and say, tell you what, let's have lunch and talk about this next week, or let's get together and talk about this. I'm gonna give it to you. We'll talk about it next week. There's some other groups I could get into that are really good about home visits or visiting people, meeting at a common place and talking about these subjects. And I think it's so important that we really have got to get back to that one-on-one. I mean, the early church, you read the book of Acts, they went house to house. We're wanting people to show up to a building. And I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. I know that that's what's worked in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. They put an ad in the paper and pray for God to bring the called and chosen. But right now we're in a case where we don't have that, like you said, the big imprint. We've got to make it a difference where we are. And I think that there's opportunities missed because we've got to change our thinking because the situation has changed. And so I think
it's probably gonna find us. You know what I mean? Yeah. I think we're in a situation where, you mentioned, a couple really great points that you bring up here. The first being that as young people, we have to know what we believe ourselves. And for you, it's a bit different because you came in from the outside. That's a different phenomenon. But that's something that I saw in my own conversion experience where I was talking with someone about it today. Got baptized at 18 because I knew the doctrines. And so it was more of a commitment. I made the commitment at 18, but I learned my need for repentance over the next 7-8 years. Like when you need to come face to face with your own need for Christ, your own capacity for being wretched and evil, and come to that understanding. And then really, like you said, make the beliefs your own. Because I think for many of us, there are a subset of people who are 3, 4, 5 generations in the Church of God, but many are in my situation where their parents came in from other belief sets. And when you come in from outside, it's a different phenomenon. There is a greater likelihood that you have made it your own. But for our generation, it is different. But we have to get to that same point because when I was going through all this in my 20s, I realized when I was coming out of it, I feel like a first generation Christian now. And then I realized there's no such thing as a second or third generation Christian. Everyone's it has to be a first generation Christian. You each have your own relationship with Christ. And so to your point, these are the kinds of issues that are going to hit young people. And you're never going to be able to avoid the Sabbath issue. You're going to need to know why that's important. And I think because if we're correct about the speculation, not only the existing movement out of evangelicalism, but if you get more of this upheaval in society, you're going to have more opportunities for conversation about it. Doesn't need to be necessarily physically mobilizing door to door. I could tell you it's happened to me numerous times in the last couple of years in a place like Albany, New York. I had one person who's not really religious at all we were talking loosely about spirituality, and she said, you know what? She came out of Catholicism, I think. She goes, I think this is hell. And I'm like, man, you are so close to like, this is not the only day of salvation, right? This is Satan's world. There are certain innate realities that I think people can sense or see, but they don't have people around them speaking to it. They don't have people around them saying, you're right, all this is nuts. This is confusing. You had a confusing life. The relationships you grew up in, like, it might be heterosexual, but they were just as dysfunctional. You are reacting to real turmoil that all stems back from the rejection of God in the garden. Like it all comes back to the same sort of thing. And so I think each one of us needs to be able to not only know it ourselves for working out our own salvation, but we're going to have plenty of opportunity to get into these discussions with people. And I think it would benefit them for us to know how to articulate these beliefs.
Totally agree. You know, there's only one generation, and it's the chosen generation. And so that's what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1 or chapter 2, excuse me. And so I think it is important for us to own it. And, you know, we've got to realize that back in the time when the Church of God, the real, you know, the explosive growth, there were like, what, 3 or 4 TV channels, and you could find the worldwide broadcast. Was it The World Tomorrow, I think? You could find that on one of those, and it was at a prime time watching slot, a time slot. And so you had the radio program, you have the 8 million a month playing through magazines. You don't have that anymore. God's like, I want you to do it. I want every one of you to participate in this. And that doesn't mean that you don't, you know, we've got to know these beliefs. Start with your most basic fundamental beliefs. Get the core beliefs, doctrines down. And it's okay if you're talking with someone and saying, you know, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll get back with you. It's okay to do that. You know, none of us know it all, you know. Or
let's open up the Bible. You know what I mean? Like let's open up and look.
Let's just read the word together, you know. And I found the truth when I was in college, and really it's an amazing testimony. I would wake up in the morning, I would pray about a subject, and I would get some verses, and I would be praying, and verses would come to my mind, is what I'm saying. And it might be Romans 14 or 1 Corinthians 10. It was always one of those verses used to challenge the truth. And someone that day would ask me about that verse. That happened to me so often in those early days. And I was kind of in like, I felt like Saving Private Ryan when the boats hit the beach on you know, and the bullets are flying. I kind of felt like that in a spiritual sense, you know, and I had to prove it or die, you know. I mean, that's a kind of the, spiritually speaking, that's kind of how it was when I was new to it. And so you had to prove it from the very beginning. And so it's a different experience. But like you said, we're still the chosen generation. And but when we can really learn to tap in this idea that wherever I go, God is trying to connect me with other people who are interested in the truth, and they could be interested in a number of doctrines, like you brought up the heaven and hell thing with the one conversation. The Sabbath, I use the Sabbath a lot because it's so simple. Yeah. But I've ministered to Muslims about the Sabbath. I've ministered to atheists using the Sabbath because you can prove God's existence using the Sabbath. The only reason we have a 7-day weekly cycle is because God made everything in Genesis. There is no other astronomical, geological, or other reason for a 7-day weekly cycle that starts with first day and ends with Sabbath, other than Genesis 1 and 2 is actually true. And so that's why every attempt to try and change the 7-day weekly cycle has been met with failure, whether it was the Babylonians or the Greeks or the Egyptians or the Russians in the Soviet Union who tried a 5-day week and a 6-day week and went back to the 7-day weekly cycle. We can literally reach any segment of the population at a given time with Jesus and the commandments with specific emphasis on the Sabbath. And then we can lead them into the other things after that. Because again, like I said earlier, even the holy days, the Sabbath is a fundamental unit that helps us understand annual Sabbaths. Yeah. The Sabbath teaches us about grace. Just as we don't work for 6 days and we rest on the 7th, we understand that we aren't saved by our works, but that salvation will produce fruit in us, and we are created unto good works. And so we come to understand that. I understand grace better now than I have ever, because even though I grew up in a belief system where grace was just like everything. Mm-hmm. That's all there was, right? But now that I keep the Sabbath, I understand more that, yes, I do work for 6 days and I rest on the 7th. In the same way, I understand I can try to do it my own way, but guess what? Yeah, I got to do it God's way And there's such a powerful emphasis, and it's a weekly emphasis that I'm reminded of that. It's not a one-time thing. I'm reminded weekly of God's grace, and that it's God's way that works, and it's God's wisdom. So yeah, I mean, so
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. It's been great talking with you, Kelly.
yeah.
Super important topic. I think it really is something I know I hadn't thought about personally until very recently, maybe the last 6 months or a year, in terms of what should my posture be, if for lack of a better phrase, towards the Sabbatarian community that I might not necessarily see as part of the same body of believers as myself, but is an important audience to engage in a group of people, because you never know what's going to happen, how God's going to work with folks. And it also, it leads to other things like what might God be working out in the future. We mentioned the social upheaval. I think for many people, especially in the Church of God community, and when I say Church of God, it's more just anyone who believes the core fundamental beliefs that, some of which we touch on CGN's website, because it's a spiritual body. There are people, it's God's church, and people who are not. We don't know who that is, but I think in the future, despite the fact that folks right now, I think, can get discouraged with the state of the body, whether it's seeing people in Messianic or Hebrew roots or fractured Church of God groups, I think many of us lament it. I think people will lament a perception of stagnation in comparison to previous decades. But I think it should be an exciting time, because there is a lot to do. And I think there are a lot of people to connect with and have these conversations with. And there's an enormous opportunity and potential for understanding and sharing of understanding to groups like this. I think, this being, CGN's got a mission to the church in terms of building community, but I think the extension of relating to the greater Sabbath keeping world for people who might have started that process is just as important. And you guys do great stuff at the BSA.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate that. I want to thank you for having me on. I really appreciate this opportunity to share more about this subject. And I would like to say that I think a great way for people to start out and how do we relate, how Church of God groups relate to other Sabbatarians, is really befriend people who do keep the Sabbath, and just focus on your commonalities. You don't have to start with differences and start peeling away at the differences. The differences will come up.
Yeah.
If you're eating together, you'll eat differently, possibly. You're celebrating differently. You have a different emphasis on outreach. The differences will come up, but if you befriend people and form trust with them, really be a sincere friend to them.
Yeah.
And you will create a bond where there's an open door if they ever want to learn more or question more and, learn more about their beliefs. If you do meet someone of a different persuasion, learn more about those beliefs, because those beliefs can be a gateway in and of themselves. Because Seventh-day Adventists, for instance, they believe the Church of Rome is the whore that rides the beast, and that's a very common Church of God belief as well, from Revelation 17. And they, will say, well, that's the Church of Rome started Sunday keeping, et cetera. And you say, that's absolutely true. And then, but keep in mind that Christmas and Easter and other things did too.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And that's what Church of God Network is about within the Church of God community as well, that there are differences that, frankly, in the Church of God's case, we view as not so important to prevent even spiritual religious celebration together. But in the case of these outside groups, like you said, it's about building trust, because if you can build a sincere friendship and trust with the individual, that's when those conversations happen. And not just conversations even about doctrinal things, but think about our best friends in the world, regardless, right? The conversations about personal struggle, conversations about differences only come from trust and closeness. And if you start out with those things, you're gonna probably cause more harm than good. You're gonna be a stumbling block to folks. And at the same time, we're not saying just fellowship with people and focus on what you agree on and never touch on the disagreements, because that's not healthy either. It's, if we're all learning and trying to grow, we have to prioritize relationships, but within that context, those things will come up, like you said. And if both sides are pursuing the truth, it's going to be a good conversation.
Yeah, and ultimately what led me into what God used to lead me into the truth, one of the key factors was someone who befriended me, and they never pushed doctrine and never, knew about the differences, but never really talked down to me or anything about those differences.
Yeah.
Just as opportunities for truth came along, brought up truth, and truth is weightier than things that aren't true. And so, and we have to realize some of these Sabbath groups have changed their beliefs over time. Seventh-day Adventists didn't used to keep Christmas and Easter. They didn't used to be Trinitarian. And ultimately, I think another thing that we want to keep in mind is Church of God Seventh-day Adventists, Worldwide Church of God, and related groups, and even Messianic and Hebrew roots to a degree, all sort of trace the roots back to Seventh-day Baptists in the 1800s. And so that's actually considered the mother Sabbath-keeping church. And it was from the Seventh-day Baptists contact with different other groups, cross-pollination, and then over time, these other groups form. And so historically, we all kind of are connected in a way.
And for the church, for the Church of God sphere, it's important to acknowledge that we do consider Church of God Seventh Day very specifically as part of the lineage of the church and part of the Church of God, despite the fact that the most of them, pretty much, but at the very least a significant chunk, do not keep the holy days. Which is an understandable, even for Church of God Network. One of the things on our core list of beliefs is keeping the holy days. But it is interesting that we do have a history of acknowledging Church of God Seventh Day, and of course, throughout history, the church in different eras has had certain bits of information and maybe lacked others. So again, it's a process of coming to knowledge and understanding, but go back to that first point. It always involves the Sabbath at some fundamental level. So
that's right. And the Sabbath is also great. We talked about upheaval outside the world. The Sabbath provides stability. And so the Sabbath is so important. It connects us to all these other groups, and we can present to the world stability in the midst of chaos. And we're all connected because of the Sabbath.
Another great point. Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate having you on. Looking forward to hopefully having you back in the future.
Thanks for having me, and I look forward to it.